Welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week, we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration, and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Today, I'll be asking Sharon to share why reflective practice is so important in the early years, especially when we're ensuring we're inclusive in our approach. So Sharon, what is reflective practice and why is this so important in this context?
Yeah, Shaddai, I think reflective practice is standing still for a moment, really, taking time away from the day-to-day routines, the day-to-day ways of being within the setting, which can be really challenging. I know for practitioners, there may be issues around staff shortages, you're having to combine rooms. There are so many different things and aspects. No one day is the same in an early years setting or provision. And that it is challenging, and you've got parents that have got different needs and different wants and different expectations for their child that practitioners are having to meet on a daily basis. However, this ability to create a space to reflect and perhaps adapt practice is key. And the reason that I say that is, again, going back to this idea that the diversity of children that we're working with is fluid and it changes all the time. So that means that the routine and the environment needs to change and adapt. But more importantly, practice. Your practice. You need to reflect on your practice because it may need to be adapted. The language that is used with one child and family will not be the same for another child and family, even if they are from the same grouping. So, for example, I might speak to a Jamaican family who define themselves as being black and they use a terminology around black. But I may speak to another family from exactly the same origins and they may speak to a narrative that is brown and speaking a completely different language and maybe have different cultural traditions that have been passed down. So here it's where reflection will be key, because it's around developing your knowledge around the child. So I'm thinking about the influences around the child. And I'm sure many practitioners, because he's embedded in everything, is good old Uri Bronfenbrenner. We think about the influences that are nearest to the child. And so reflection about those influences and the communities in which children are existing may look different, may need to look different so that the learning can occur. So reflection in and reflection on practice becomes really important.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree what you're saying there about it being an ongoing process and something that we need to continue to keep doing as culture changes, the needs of our families and the communities that we serve also changes over time. Just reflecting on my own experience, I guess the experience of my students who are often quite bad at reflection.
Yes.
And I think that's to an extent because we're all quite time poor. And we can often see it as unimportant, or we can't really be bothered to reflect and think back on our practice. It can often raise a bit of anxiety sometimes to think back on the work we're doing and whether that's the most appropriate way or whether we could be doing something better. How might you respond to practitioners who don't really want to bother with engaging in reflective practice?
It's really hard, isn't it, Shaddai? It's hard to look at yourself and think about what have I done? But I think it's important to look at what you've done well. We as a society tend to look at what hasn't gone well. Start with looking at what went well and what might you do to improve. Start from that position. So it's being less critical of self. It's being kinder to yourself as a practitioner. So I start with a narrative that talks about celebrating what you already do well. Work that I've done recently, I always ask settings to tell me about the journey that they're on. Because they'll say, oh, we've not got inclusion in our setting. And I'll say, well, you will have, because you have an inclusive policy, because you're working with children from diverse groups. Tell me something about what you did really well and that you're really proud of that went well with the children. So here, for me, the team reflection. If it's hard to look at self, then reflect as a team. Look at the planning that you did together and in there embed. So for me, seeing inclusion is about it being alive and being in operation at all times, rather than a policy that sits on a shelf and each individual member of staff has to review that on an annual basis and tick, I reviewed it and I understand the policy. Embed it within your planning processes. So just as you would do for literacy, numeracy, sciences, all those other prime and specific areas, have a section that talks about inclusion and inclusivity. Put that into your planning documentation and map the journey that you're on and reflect on it as a team. If there are members of the team where there are weaker points in practice and pedagogy, then look at it and how you can support each other and how you can support that practice. And more importantly, then how you can support that individual that may have the weaker practice.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We all bring our life histories and life experiences to our role and our jobs every single day. We don't leave our kind of personal self at the door when we go to work with children.
Yeah.
So that critical reflection on those sorts of life experiences that have shaped how we understand children and childhood can be so, so important. But there is a difference between good reflection and bad reflection, isn't there? And sometimes reflection can be a little bit superficial or on the surface. Are there other examples of bad reflection in your experience?
Yeah, I think it comes from a narrative of we've always done it this way, so this is how it will always be done. And that predominates, unfortunately, still in the sector, particularly for practitioners that may have had X number of years of experience. But that's when poorer quality starts to creep into practice. And that's what we talk about. Just like there are hierarchies within children's play, there are hierarchies within practice and the dominant discourse. And I think that is for me bad practice. That is for me, that needs to be challenged. And so I'm asking for a space to incorporate colleagues that may have had less experience, but come with rich cultural knowledge, rich lived experiences, and understanding around their ethnic origin and the traditions and cultures that are embedded within those origins, and creating a space for their voice to be heard. So just as we talk about voices with young children, it's equally as important to have those shared voices from those practitioners or educators that could be disregarded, silenced, nuanced, invalidated, where their practice is invalidated because they're seen as being new. Their practice may be new in terms of assessment, and evaluation of learning. But when we're talking about inclusion, everybody's lived experience is just as equally valued. So for me, this is where listening and learning from each other is key. So I do have examples where I use an activity where I get practitioners to draw either a portrait of themselves, I'll draw it however it sees fit, of themselves, or maybe of each other if they feel less confident. And you can guarantee that they'll all say, I'm not an artist and I'm not creative, but you will be absolutely blown away by how creative we are. We are creatives when we're working with, I think just working with young children, you're a creative. And it's not about the end product of the picture. It's about the journey and the process of discovery about each other. Because what I ask practitioners to do is have conversations of, what is going on around their culture and their tradition, and sharing that. So again, it's going back to that shared narrative with each other. And what it does is it means that those groupings that would have been invalidated some way then get a position, their positionality comes to the fore. They're able to share, and they're, more importantly, they're able to feel valued. And I think we all need to be valued.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sounds like a really good activity for listeners to perhaps go away and do in their settings to reflect as a team as much as an individual. But there are some challenges to reflection, and I can imagine listeners thinking that there are issues with time that make it quite difficult to do this reflective practice. What strategies and advice might you give to those listeners?
Yeah, I think most of the time there will be a moment where you'll have staff meetings. There will be moments where you might sit in the middle of the day or at the end of the day to evaluate the learning that has happened. I know that practitioners are evaluating planning processes. So what I offer is that within that, this is where the space is to reflect on inclusion. Take it as an opportunity. You may have a training day. Devote a training day to those processes. Listen to this podcast, maybe, for some strategies on how to reflect on your practice. Try and do it as a team. Even when you're working with children, there are many, many times where I have observed practitioners talking about external events that are not relevant to what's happening around the children. I'm not saying don't do that, but what I'm saying is perhaps some of those conversations could be handed over to reflecting on what's happening in the here and now and what's happening in the moment planning for the children and for themselves. So there are always opportunities for reflection. I suppose it's how we choose. It also needs to come from maybe a managerial or a room steer, so where the power perhaps might sit. So again, lead by example, role model by example. And it becomes really part and parcel then. The settings where practice is exemplary is where they do it as part and parcel of the lived experience in the daily routines of the setting. So it's become embedded and it's normalised rather than being sat in a policy on a shelf. It's living and it's active.
Yeah, and I guess we're quite fortunate in the early years sector in the UK that we do have quite an active CPD network. There's usually not a weekend without an early years conference on, so listeners should absolutely engage with those because there's some really good CPD training opportunities about. I really like what you're saying about embedding reflection into your day-to-day role as well, ensuring that it's not something that's added on perhaps, but really something that's made space and time for within one's everyday practice. I guess another point really there is about reflection leading to action. So of course it's one thing to reflect and have that thought, but how can practitioners then put that into practice within their everyday settings?
Yeah, that's in my research. I use praxeological methods and I talk about praxeology. Praxeology just means action in the simplest sense. And so again, we're so wedded to documentation. Maybe we're using software packages to do that. But again, get those software packages to adapt and include some boxes that use reflection on inclusion. So again, going back to this idea of praxis, practice in action, on action, this idea of transformation. So in my research, I talk about a transformational pedagogy, a transformational practice. It takes time. It's seeking out and looking for ways of doing practice differently around and with the children. So again, going back to if we treat children as citizens with rights, if we put their needs at the heart of what we are doing, then action becomes real. It becomes part and parcel of the practice of the setting and the culture of the setting. So it almost becomes as though you do it without thinking about it. And that's exactly how prejudice operates. It's done in a unconscious way. Well, let's consciously do it until it becomes unconscious.
Yeah,
That's how I see it.
I think that's really, really important to say there. And as lecturers, Sharon and myself, we often ask students to reflect on their practice and do projects that will lead to action within their settings. But you don't have to be in the university space to reflect and put work into action. I'm thinking about a fantastic setting up in Falkirk in Scotland that implemented this marvellous mealtimes project, not asked of them by a university module for a degree or anything, but off their own backs on the basis of reflection about how mealtimes are working, and then putting some action in place to have a slower kind of pedagogical approach. So it's not something that only students can do within the university space, but all settings can actively reflect and put those practices into action, can't they?
Absolutely, Shaddai, and I know of that that work that has been done in Scotland, and I've drawn on it in the conversations that I have with other settings to say, make meal times work for you. So, because we talked about, when a child is developing an artifact or through their play, and the children are almost conditioned to clear up and tidy up because it's mealtime, perhaps try and leave that activity out and then have a conversation about it. And the same applies for inclusion. Within that lunchtime, within that space, I did it in my setting. Doesn't always work, and I have a deep appreciation that practitioners need breaks away from practice. But for those practitioners that were left within those meal times, that they sat and ate with the children, and the conversations continued in an unhurried way, the questioning within those meal times, using different forms of how children may choose to eat their meals. So a child who is used to sitting on the floor, eating with their hands, the practitioner gets down on the floor, eats their meal with their hands, with that child, asks those questions. Can you show me? Is this what happens at home? Tell me a little bit more about. Use those routines to enrich the experiences for the children. And that happened because the child resisted to be seated at a table and told to use a knife and fork. But instead, what the practitioner did, they went with the child's lived experience. How wonderful is that? So you're absolutely right, Shaddai. It's about using these routines. And I talk about, Reggio. Think of Reggio Emilia and the third teacher, the environment. Use the environment and the child's knowledge and the child's expertise. Trust that expertise. Why does it have to be that each child is sat at that table at lunchtime? Adapt it and share that amongst the other children so that they're learning the richness from other cultural contexts as well. What a celebration that is, food, music, such wonderful platforms for celebrating cultural contexts. So yes, it is about that actioning, making that action come alive and finding different ways to embed that into practice. It doesn't always have to be done the way it's always been done. It's very hard to move away from existing ways of knowing. We're creatures of habit, human beings, aren't we? But I don't know about you, but I just love learning about other cultural contexts. I really do. It brings such a richness to your knowledge. So no, you don't have to be learning from scholarly or research-based approaches. Learn from each other. That's what I would say to the educator. Learn from each other. Embrace the diversity that you all bring. Because recently, Shaddai, use an example of myself. I asked the practitioners to define my identity, and they did. They went down black. And then I added, but a part of my diversity and my identity is coming from Spanish origins. You would never see that by looking at me. And that's the same for every individual. So yeah, you need
absolutely.
To speak.
It's
speak
about
to each other.
Yeah, it's about that critical reflection on the self, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think that marvellous mealtimes and your example of mealtimes is a really good example of a moment in the practitioner's day when they can really reflect on their practice and consider whether just because it's the way it's always been done, that is the best way for the children. And ultimately, it is again about following the child's interests and really making sure that we're meeting their needs as best as possible.
Absolutely.
Then putting that reflection into action. So I think that's a fantastic place to end this episode. Thank you very much, Sharon.
Thank you, Shaddai.
I would like to say a huge thank you to our guest Sharon for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Shaddai Tembo, and Sharon Colilles. If you have been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your setting and links to relevant resources.